So I just wanted to say welcome to everyone and thank you for showing up. This is our fourth webinar in a series that we're doing for the California Psychedelic Bar Association. And again, I should note that we're recording the webinar and we're going to post this to our YouTube channel and I think also some podcast apps once we figure out how to do that. I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Rebecca Lee. I'm one of the two co-founders of the California Psychedelic Bar Association. My connection to the space is that I'm the general counsel of Journey Collab. We are a psychedelic pharmaceutical company that is developing mescaline for the treatment of alcohol use disorder. And we also have an unusual structure in that we have set up a reciprocity trust that holds 10% of the company's founding equity to be shared with the indigenous groups that have stewarded these medicines, as well as other psychedelic stakeholders in the space. And I'm very excited that my co-founder, Paul Slattery, is here also. He's the general counsel of Eleusis, which is another psychedelic pharmaceutical company. And Paul has just done a tremendous job getting our webinar series up and running and has really been doing the heavy lifting, doing the first three. So I'm very excited to pick up the baton from here. But if you want to catch those other webinars we've done with Professor David Nichols, Professor Charles Nichols, and then also Matt Zorn and Sarah Coleman. You can find those all on our YouTube channel. I'm also very honored today to be speaking with Jayashree Mitra of Fox Rothschild LLP. She is an intellectual property and regulatory expert with a long career working in the pharmaceutical and biotech fields, including a previous stint at Yale as a neuropharmaceutical researcher. And she is now an emerging expert in the intellectual property and related regulatory issues facing the psychedelic sector. So Jay, thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad we were finally able to do this and I'm excited to talk with you today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, great. So you have an incredibly impressive resume, which I could go on about, but I'd like our attendees to hear it from the horse's mouth. So could you walk me through your career and how you got to where you are today?
Certainly. I came to in the United States in my early 20s, absolutely settled in my mind I was going to be the world's greatest neuroscientist. I was at Yale. I was doing my PhD in neuropharmacology. My topic was on the effects of cocaine on the developing brain. And that came out of really the crack baby story, which I can go on and on about how there's no such thing as a crack baby. But it introduced me to two things which I had not been exposed to before. One is how there is a disconnect often between what's really happening in science and what is the public message. For example, it's easy to use the words crack baby, but it's a derogatory term which really doesn't have any scientific meaning and has been used to condemn a large group of people. The other issue that I became very sensitive to is the socio-political impact of the war on drugs, which I had not appreciated living in India, which has a completely different regulatory regime. So I was finishing my PhD. I got in a car crash. I needed another job. And I got a call from a marketing agency asking if I could come and talk science to non-scientists. I thought that was great. So I got my PhD. I went and worked as a marketer. And there I learned how to talk to people who had to be given the science in an accessible manner. I could not resort to jargon or technology or hide behind a wall of scientific papers. I had to make it accessible. I really loved that. And so when I recovered, I didn't go back to science. I became a lawyer. And in the course of my career, I'm mainly in the pharmaceutical industry. I've done a lot of litigation, patent litigation, antitrust litigation. If it touches IP in some form or the other, I've touched it. And that's basically been my career trajectory: a scientist, writer, marketer, and now a lawyer.
That's awesome. Someone who's also had kind of an interesting path to this field. I really always enjoy meeting other people who did not just go straight to law school from undergrad. So thank you for that. And if I can ask, what drew you to working in the psychedelic sector specifically?
Well, the way I see psychedelics is that it's another molecule that is psychoactive, that impacts the way our brain works. And for me, using the term psychedelics, I know there are a lot of cultural connotations, religious connotations, legal connotations. For me, the simplest way of looking at this, it is affecting my brain. So what is it doing? And that's how I came into psychedelics. I was working in cannabis one day. I was speaking at a conference and someone came up to me after the conference and asked if I knew anything about psychedelics. And my response was, what do you want to talk about? I'm very happy to go on for hours on the molecular aspect, on the pharmacology, on the history of these products. So for me, I was just coming home because I was doing the science, I was doing the cultural and social and political background that's always been a part of my research and part of my interest. And I was seeing the birth of a new industry. What's not to be attracted? It was wonderful.
Thank you for that. And then, I assume most of the folks on this call or the folks who'll be watching on our YouTube channel are going to be lawyers who are at least broadly familiar with the concept of patents and intellectual property generally. But, because we have a wide range of interests and backgrounds and folks who come to this field from different backgrounds and organization, I'm hoping you could set the stage for us and give us a basic overview of what we're talking about. Really start with, what is a patent? How does a psychedelic company get one? And kind of walk me through the life cycle of a patent application.
Sure. So a patent is a right to exclude, and practically every government in the world offers patent protection for something that is novel, that is inventive, that we have not seen before. And honestly, the motivation for giving a monopoly right to something that you've created goes back to ancient times. On researching patents, I discovered that in ancient Greece, you could get 6 months monopoly or several months of monopoly for inventing a new dish. As a cook, I love that. But when we are talking about the patent system in the United States, which is the easiest one to explain, you have the USPTO, United States Patent and Trademark Office. And the first step in obtaining a patent is filing an application. In the application, you have the disclosures, the specification, and where you describe what's your invention and also why it is inventive. That's a good story to tell. I often read patents which just have a lot of jargon in them, but for me, a really good patent is something that explains why is this new. Sometimes we are dealing with molecules that have been in use for generations, but we are still finding something new for them. And sometimes this is the first time we've seen the molecule. We discovered it by screening, 10 million molecules in the lab bench and found one that was exciting, and now we want to patent it. But it's important to tell the story. And then the important part of a patent from the commercial standpoint are the claims. The claims are defining the boundaries of your property. So just as when you have a house or an apartment, what is the scope of your property. A claim in a patent describes that. Now, I'm making it sound very simple, but patent lawyers live and die by arguing over every word as to what is a disclosure, what is the scope of a claim, and we can get into that exciting stuff, should you ever want to litigate or prosecute a patent. But simply put, a patent is something that the United States Patent and Trademark Office grants you. It's a monopoly right. It's a right to exclude. And this is really important to remember. It is the right to exclude others from practicing your invention for a period of 20 years. You can go to different countries around the world and you can get international patent protection. And a part of your strategy when you're considering developing your IP portfolio is considering what is it that you are asking for, what is it that you're likely to get, and what are the countries where you'll have the protections, because that is what has to come together to as a part of your business model. Now, in terms of filing a patent, a lot of people file what's called a provisional patent. That is, you just want to get something in quickly because United States is the first to file country now, which means if you have something new, file it tomorrow, file it today if you can. Just call me, we'll work full time and we'll get it filed, because it's like planting your flag in the ground. You're the first person to reach the moon. Get your flag down there, because if somebody else beats you even by a single day, you're not going to get it. They're going to get it. So now, again, the nuances of a provisional patent we can go into, but a lot of people prefer to file the provisional because we can just get it in quickly. And then we have a 1-year period in which to file the final utility patent. Now, patents can come in different forms. You can have a plant patent. You can have a design patent. And this is actually important because, we can go into medical devices, but a design patent is essentially ornamental. but what's most common are the utility patents. So you have a compound, you have, compounds come in crystalline forms. Maybe you want to patent to the crystalline form. You have enantiomers. Enantiomers are like the same molecule. It's like your left hand and right hand. You have two different forms. You can patent each of the different forms. You can do formulations, methods of manufacture, methods of treatment, combination with other technology. An interesting trend I'm seeing right now is combining psychedelics with virtual reality. That's really cool. And it kind of creates new opportunities. So once you get your patent, your final patent application in, then what we go through what's called the prosecution. Now that can be a few months. It can take a few years. It's really where you're arguing with the patent office as to what you're going to get as your final set of claims. And then out of one patent, we can, get continuations. And then there are strategic considerations. If you have, say, one omnibus patent that combines a lot of different inventions, and then you later dissect them out one by one, is that a good strategy? Or should you file 10 separate applications, each of them covering a small bit of what you're trying to protect? So these are all business considerations that you have to keep in mind, but fundamentally you file your first application, it goes through the prosecution, and then the patent office decides what is the scope of the claims that you can get. And in the psychedelic space, this is the great thing about patents. You can get patents, that's not a problem, because a patent is a right to exclude. You don't necessarily have to practice it. You don't necessarily have to worry about whether I have a Schedule 1 lab where I can go and make my stuff. In certain jurisdictions, you do. But here, since it's a monopoly power and it's your right to exclude, you have a little more leeway as to what kind of subject matter you can have in your patents. I hope that answers your question.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. That's very helpful. And again, sort of just to set the background for folks so we kind of all have a common base of understanding, can you tell me how a new drug, for example, a novel psychedelic compound, would get from its invention to FDA approval, which is, it's a different system, but related. And I kind of want to get into how systems interact. Yeah.
So view the patents and FDA as like two circles of the Venn diagram. They have huge sections that are completely separate and one section that interacts. Now, I've had to deal with expert witnesses who tell me, this is such an amazing drug. Why is the patent even being challenged? And I have to explain to them, a drug can be awesome and the patents can be completely awful. And the patents can be awesome and the drug can be killing everybody. They really, one doesn't speak to the other. But there is a very important interaction to keep in mind. So let's look at the FDA regulatory pathway. Now, what is the FDA looking at? It's looking at efficacy and safety data within the parameters it has set in its investigational new drug during the investigational new drug application process. So you can start with the new chemical entity, NCE. Now, this is very interesting because you would think, why should psilocybin be a new chemical entity? It's been there in the market forever. But if you look at it, Epidiolex, which is CBD, it got an NCE status. And what NCE status gives you is 5 years of regulatory exclusivity. So you're filing a new drug application. You are requesting an NCE status. You're getting 5 years of regulatory exclusivity, which means the FDA is not going to look at another product that leverages your data.
So NCE, sorry to interrupt, but NCE basically means the FDA hasn't seen it before, whether or not it's new to the public, right?
Yeah. It's new chemical entity. That's at least that's the, that's what I walked away when I saw Epidiolex got NCE. I was like, whoa, how did they manage that? But kudos to them. But so you have, so you're filing a new drug application because it's the first time the product is before the FDA. Now, it could be that you have an NDA on a product that you have, you've used the molecule before and you have a whole different indication, in the first time around, it was formulation A, now you're using formulation B in a whole different set of situations. And there are there are many circumstances in which you can have an NDA without an NCE necessarily. But then you have what's called an ANDA, abbreviated new drug application. And this is where the Hatch-Waxman framework comes into play. So as I said, you get 5 years of regulatory exclusivity. Well, at the end of the 5 years.
And sorry, can you just say what that means, regulatory exclusivity, just so
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the FDA is not going to look at another product which is leveraging your efficacy and safety data. That's the simplest way to put it. So say I put in a product, say I'm the first person who came in with aspirin, okay? And I show FDA, this is the efficacy and safety data. FDA is like, you just spent $100 million or $1 billion on this. You know what, 5 years, I'm not going to look at another application which does the same thing. But at the end of the 5 years, and this is why generic drugs can be so cheap, is that what the generic drug can say is that my product is bioequivalent. So if you have, say, salicylic chloride or fluoride, now don't hold me to the chemistry, but you have the same chemical compound, and you're showing that your product is bioequivalent to the brand, then the FDA, in theory, will approve your abbreviated new drug application, which probably costs you $250,000. Now, what the Hatch-Waxman framework does is, it creates this pathway, but at the same time, if I, as a brand, say when I file my NDA, I told the FDA, I've got 10 patents surrounding this drug. The FDA lists them in something what we call the Orange Book. Now, when I file my abbreviated new drug application asking the FDA to approve my product because it is bioequivalent to the brand, I have to send a notification to the brand. And I have to tell them these 10 patents you've listed in your Orange Book, they are either invalid or I don't infringe them. And then the brand has 45 days in which to sue me. And then the FDA halts the approval process for, I think it's 32 months or something, while the litigation goes through the courts. Now, if the brand wins the patent battle, then the generic can't enter even if they get approval, because you'll be infringing somebody's patents. On the other hand, if the generic wins in litigation, then the FDA can approve it because there are no patents blocking your entry. This is a very common framework that's, we've been doing it for decades. It's how almost every small molecule works. And in the case of psychedelics, I expect we are going to see a comparable situation because they are small molecules.
Right. And so just to ask a follow-up question on that. So is that where you see most of the litigation happening around patents in the pharmaceutical field, or, would it be, okay, so it's generics coming in and wanting to have their own generic version of the drug?
Yes.
That's the challenge. Okay.
Yes. I mean, look at the math of it. Mathematics. You have a $10 billion drug. You have 20 generics come into, because a lot of these small molecules are not difficult to make. At the end of the day, psilocybin, MDMA, LSD are not difficult to make. Okay, I'm being a little arrogant, but you can make them. It's not
right.
rocket science. And if
there are established paths in the literature, yes.
Yeah, there are established paths in the literature, and you don't have to go through expensive clinical trials. You just do the bioequivalency studies. You get in an application for $250,000. You can sell the drug for like 10 cents instead of selling the drug for $20 a pop or $200 a pop. So your $10 billion market suddenly went down to your market share of like $1 billion or $100 million. You got wiped out. But so there is a huge motivation to keep the generic from coming in to protect your marketplace. Now, before I forget, I do want to touch on 505(b)(2). 505(b)(2) sits between an NDA and an ANDA. Like I said, for an ANDA, it has to be bioequivalent, so it's the same drug. And I should mention here what's called AB rating. So so when you go to a pharmacy and you put in your prescription, there's a brand version, there's a generic version. The pharmacist is going to fill with the generic version because that they're required to. It's AB rated. That means it's directly substitutable. Now, sometimes the generic doesn't work, and there are certain disease conditions where, or people may not react well to the generic because, remember, it's bioequivalent. It's not identical. So say, some areas where I've come across this issue is depression, seizures. You shift the blood levels a little bit because you went to a bioequivalent product and suddenly your condition is no longer that well controlled. So they may write brand only. But typically, that's what AB rated means, is that you're going to get the generic version because it's supposed to be bioequivalent to the more expensive version, and everybody saves money, right? What is a 505(b)(2)? A 505(b)(2) is a product where you're being able to leverage some of the data from the new drug application. Say, for example, you have a drug that's a chloride salt, and the brand drug is a fumarate salt, just to kind of give a general example. So the ANDA would have to be the fumarate salt. But you can have a 505(b)(2), which is the chloride salt, and you can say, I'm relying on the efficacy and safety data, because once you are consuming the product, the salt form doesn't matter. You're just absorbing the molecule and it does the same thing. With 505(b)(2), what we normally see are new formulations, new methods of treatment. That's the kind of area where we see 505(b)(2), because you can get 3 years of exclusivity, you can have your own set of patents. There's a whole rhythm to it. And the reason I think it's really important for us to remember that in the psychedelic space is because these are not new molecules. So on the basic molecule, on the bare naked molecule, you're very unlikely to have patent protection. So the 505(b)(2) market could be very lucrative in the sense it can leverage off that expensive efficacy and safety data to a great extent and still be able to bring the next generation of products into the market in a far more affordable manner. So I think when we are looking at the psychedelic industry, instead of just looking at a brand and a generic, we really should keep this middle ground in mind, because this could well be, not just in psychedelics, but also in cannabis and in other traditional medicine forms, a really lucrative pathway to market.
Interesting. So can you tell me like how you could see that playing out? Like give an example of what you might see there.
So certainly, so you have psilocybin right now going through clinical trials. I forget off the top of my head what the indications are. I think it's treatment-resistant depression or MDD, something. So yes, so you have safety data from phase 1. This dose is going to be safe, right? So I come with a new formulation and I say that, okay, my blood levels are going to be the same, but my formulation is different because it's easier to take. Maybe it's shorter, it's longer acting, or the route of administration is different, or it's a new indication. Maybe I'm using it, say, to treat some form of addiction, or I'm using it to treat, PMS in women. So now you have a new indication, but you can leverage off some of that existing data to support your 505(b)(2) application. Now, I'm making this all sound very simple, and it is not. I'm simply saying that to keep in mind, you have a molecule where the bare naked molecule is likely not going to be patentable, and you're in a position after the 5-year exclusivity period to leverage some of the data to find a cheaper and more efficient way to commercialize your product for a new indication that hopefully doesn't have patent protection, or you have your own patent protection, or you have a different ball game going on over here. It doesn't necessarily have to be the bioequivalent. It can be your own unique niche product. I mean, I haven't even gone into, say, maybe you have a topical form. I don't know. You have a transdermal form. There's so many opportunities where you can find a way to get the molecule into the market for a therapeutic need while leveraging off the data that came out of the clinical trial, because ultimately it's the same molecule.
Right. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. And so would you say like that's sort of the interaction between the two regulatory regimes that lawyers need to understand? It's patents on the one hand and FDA regulatory.
Yes, absolutely, because your patents give you protection. And the interesting thing is, now say if let's just take a drug that we all know, Lipitor, right? When it first came out, atorvastatin, it was discovered in the lab. So you didn't have other people being able to patent it. You're not looking at indigenous knowledge. Maybe there were other people out there with, some prior art because they looked at a comparable molecule at some point of time, maybe, but that's as far as you can get, right? And so one drug company got to control the development of the product, the prior art, and had an in-depth knowledge of what the literature was surrounding that product. By the time it went through the FDA approval process, by the time you got to the patent wars over it. Now think of something like mescaline or psilocybin or CBD or THC, molecules that have been in history forever, right? So you probably are going to see patents that don't even belong to the company that holds the NDA. There may be third-party patents. There may be somebody in some foreign country has filed an application that is now prior art. We don't know. So the uncertainties are, in my opinion, more complex. And also, when you're developing a product, you can't just look at your nearest big commercial competitor and say, okay, that person will have all the necessary patents, and that's all that I have to look at. You really need to do a sweep through literature to see where your barriers to entry are, because they could well be held by some small biotech company somewhere who has that one patent that just kind of will really stand in your way.
Great, that's super helpful. So, I mean, with that background, I guess, I want to ask you, what I'm curious, what you see as the most salient kind of emerging intellectual property issue facing the psychedelic industry.
I think we are going to see some interesting patent wars, and we are going to see interesting prior art emerge. Mm-hmm. Because when we are prosecuting a patent, our budget, if I get a 6-figure budget, I'm doing very well. Usually it's 5 figures. And then I'm having to consider international. When we are into litigation, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar budget. And there it's no holds barred search for that key piece of prior art, which I said could be a dissertation sitting on a research lab somewhere, in some country that no one ever goes to. And that's where I think the patentability issue is going to become very serious. Now, I believe in patents. I'm like, file the patents and we'll see, what happens in the wars. That's my approach. And the other thing I think we'll see in psychedelics is, because the molecules are known, is that we're going to see a focus on finding ways to protect IP that, that have to actually be quite imaginative. Like, we talk about methods of treatment, we talk about formulations, but all of these classes of patents have weaknesses. Now, on the other hand, if you are, say, developing a method of treatment which has certain biophysical parameters, for example, administering a dose within a certain EEG reading range or certain types of eye movement. Now, there it gets a lot more interesting, because that is probably going to survive prior art because we just didn't have the technology even a generation ago. And it could offer you the kind of market protection you need to recoup your investment. So I think what we are going to see in IP as we evolve and as we understand more of the challenges is we are going to see very innovative approaches to protecting IP. Now, in psychedelics, there is also the North Star Ethics Pledge. There is a commitment to accessibility. There's a commitment to us all working together. And the way I see it is that if you have a patent, you can always give it away. On the other hand, if you don't have a patent and someone comes and sues you, you're faced with a multi-million-dollar bill. So file and give it away if you have to, but also think, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that will not just improve your commercial value as a company, but also be a guidepost to future innovation? I think there is a lot to be done. And I think with psychedelics, this interaction between different modalities is where we'll see the development of a lot new IP, and which I think will be very, promising and wonderful for the patient.
That's great. That's super helpful. And sort of relatedly, on the FDA side, I'm curious what you see as the most salient emerging regulatory issue that's facing the industry. I mean, I know a lot of folks have been very concerned, for example, that the DEA has this proposed rulemaking where they're going to be adding 5 new tryptamines to Schedule 1, right? So I'm curious, is that what we should be worried about DEA action, or what do you think there are other regulatory issues that the sector and the lawyers should be concerned about?
I don't like to use the word worried, because we've seen everything. We've coped with everything. We'll manage. And the DEA and FDA, the FDA is not going to stop you from doing clinical research because something's listed in the in the Controlled Substances Act. It's been routinely dealing with that issue. So if you're interested in the development, I would say talk to a lawyer. This is not something we've not had to address. And the DEA likes to put new molecules on. I think there's a more fundamental discussion to be had as to the war on drugs and its relevance, and whether this was a mistake we need to step back from totally. So I would not spend my time too concerned about this. I'd like to talk about some interesting thoughts I've been hearing in the industry, which kind of got me thinking as to, okay, how would FDA deal with this? I mean, one of the issues at psychedelics is that the involvement of the therapist is very important. I think we all recognize that your aftercare, the care the therapist provides during the session. Are we going? Yeah, before, during, after. This is a really important part of your therapy. Now, usually when we talk about FDA approval, we're just talking about the molecule. We are never talking about your treatment in conjunction with some form of clinical care or support. I personally think that's a bridge too far right now to cross. But I think even if we don't see it on the FDA side, maybe we'll see it on the branding side. I mean, there are a lot of drugs, for example, if I take something to manage my weight or to stop smoking, the pharmaceutical company will usually say, hey, I want you to sign up for these services because we've seen patients who receive support get to their outcomes much faster, right? So that's a branding opportunity. So are we going to see something like that in the psychedelic industry where you'll have certain kind of licenses or certain kind of training that sets apart one set of caregivers over other caregivers? But I think from a regulatory perspective, it's a question that I've been asked and I don't know the answer to, because I've asked and I still don't have a good answer, is there now time to think about not just about the molecule and the disease condition, but what kind of what kind of therapeutic surrounding is that administered in? I don't know. That to me is a fascinating question. And in terms of the DEA, I personally feel there is a need to just rethink the whole war on drugs and this habit of sticking new molecules in. I just don't see how that's helping anybody except creating more barriers to development of effective drugs.
But particularly Schedule 1, right?
Yeah.
When my understanding is that there's no actual evidence of abuse of these particular tryptamines, but I don't want to soapbox. I'm curious, when you say it's a bridge too far, I mean, so what I've been told, my understanding is, FDA doesn't want to regulate the practice of medicine, but, we do have the REMS, right? So, why do you think, I mean, and we know that, for example, in the clinical trials, FDA is requiring, quite a lot of monitoring. I know MAPS,
right. Absolutely.
To therapists. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, first of all, what is care is something that's really between the patient and the doctor, and their clinician. I really do not want to see a regulatory agency get involved in deciding who is the right therapist for me. So from a patient perspective, I do have a problem with it. And then if the FDA gets involved, we all know that the quality, the human factor is very uncertain. So how is the FDA going to certify that somebody is adequate or not adequate? Are we just talking about certain check the boxes? Can that be administered by machines? For example, if you require that certain things be monitored, for example, if you require that heart rate, eye movement, EEG, these things be monitored, that's fine, but you don't need to designate somebody has to be in a continuum of care to get those parameters recorded, right? So that's, I think, where my concern comes in and why I see it's a bridge too far, because the FDA would be assuming a role that it is not really suited to perform. And personally, I also think it creates a barrier to patient access. I mean, we want to make this as comfortable and as easy for the patient to receive and also not have to face judgment or have to kind of travel somewhere to get the treatment. We want to make this accessible. So I am concerned that inserting the therapist into the treatment as a regulatory requirement could adversely affect access to the product. I think that is my biggest concern. And I also don't see why the FDA needs to get involved in something that's really about between the patient and the physician.
So do you see that you don't think that that's going to be part of a REMS requirement, right? That it'll be different, right? I guess is the FDA likely to do some kind of monitoring requirement or?
Yeah, but I'd like to see what the monitoring requirement is. And I think while I do understand, I absolutely understand that this is an area where a therapist's involvement is very critical. Mm-hmm. I'm also concerned about patient access. I'm also concerned about, interfering with the doctor, in the relationship between the doctor and patient. And I will say this, I'm waiting to see how it shakes out. I have an open mind. I'm willing to be convinced. At this time, I am on the side of, I think we need to let the patient and doctor sort this out without imposing an obligation.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you for that. And so I'm curious, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you like to see changed in either the federal or state regulation of psychedelics? If it were entirely up to you, what are the pain points that need correcting?
I think this war on drugs is a big problem for me. And it's been a problem ever since I first read about it when I came to this country. It doesn't make sense. And at the end of the day, it's just the 20th century where we really came up with the war on drugs, right? Before that, it was pretty much a free for all. And, there have been some negative connotations through history associated with the use of certain plant-based products. I'm not denying it, but at the same time, we were surviving quite well as a civilization. Why this sudden draconian legal system that's really caused a lot of harm to the society, and for what? I don't see the cost benefit analysis. So what I would like to see is opening up of research, making the molecule more accessible, improving public understanding of what it involves. There's a good and bad side to everything. Let's confront them both. Let's have the public education about it. Let's have the public discussion about it and see where it fits into our lives without this fear that you're going to spend your life in prison because you were caught with, 10 grams of a substance. I think that is taking things to a level which I just don't see how that can be justified. And I also would like to see, if we open up the knowledge base, the great thing about the human mind is that we love discovering new things. Right now, we have a small universe of molecules we consider psychedelics. There could well be a lot more molecules that we know nothing about with similar effects on our brains and which could have a huge therapeutic value for us as a civilization. Why are we shutting off access to something that could really improve our lives because we are caught in this drug war mentality? So my ideal thing is end the drug war, open up research, open up public dialogue. Let's, let the mind work out what is good and what is bad. And I'm sure we'll all come out the better for it. I'm very optimistic about that.
No, I love that. And I tend to share similar views, but I'm curious, if you could just drill down a little deeper, does that mean, are you talking about just the criminal sanctions? Like, are you in favor of decriminalization, or are you in favor of really kind of doing away with or rethinking entirely the Controlled Substances Act? If you could just talk a little more about that.
I would like to rethink the Controlled Substances Act. As a practical matter, that's not going to happen. I'll settle for decriminalization. I'll settle for increased discussion, and I would settle for increased scientific research with easier access to the molecules, where we can tap into our own, scientific infrastructure to find new ways to bring benefit to patients around the world, and not just in the psychedelics we know, but new ones that we can identify and develop without the constant fear of criminal prosecution and having your life destroyed.
Amen to that. So I'm curious, for lawyers who are interested in working in the psychedelic space, who, maybe are not yet working in the sector, where would you tell them the work is today, and in the near term, what should they be doing if they want to join, more effectively?
I find one area that's seriously underserved and which could do with a lot more attorney time is regulations. I know we like to say terrible things about regulatory agencies, but they do exist for a reason. And as somebody who's been in drug development for a long time and reading some of the awful histories where unregulated market for pharmaceutical products has caused major tragedies. So I'm comfortable with having a regulatory environment that is fair, that is working towards actually promoting patient health. I do feel at times that maybe that's not what the regulatory agencies are doing right now. They're more like interested in politics. But I find it really hard to find people who understand at a granular level what the regs are. If you're going to organize a clinical trial, and you want to say, okay, I want to do a decentralized clinical trial, everything is going to be remote. Okay, that was awesome in the time of COVID, but how are we going to do that now when we are coming out of COVID and we are talking about a product and talking about care pre, during, and post care, so when I'm faced with a puzzle like that, I'm like, oh, I have to think about that for a day or two before I have an answer to it. So I think there are a lot of regulatory issues that because we are moving into a very new world in how patients are treated, how clinical trials are designed, how data and knowledge is decentralized. How do you get investors in, what kind, are we talking about a Web3 system where we are decentralizing our, our organization and our, fundraising? There's, to me, there are scientists who know the technology very well. Mm-hmm. There are people who know the FDA pathways very well. What we are right now seeing is a collision between different advances in the way we design clinical trials, how we monitor patients, how we collect data, how we monetize that information. And I think having a lawyer who is at that cutting edge is very useful. Now, I have to say, it's probably not going to pay all your bills right now. So have a day job of something else. But if I were to say, advise somebody looking in 10 years to be the market leader in a specific, I would say, look at the interaction between psychedelics, regulation, state, federal, international, cross-border movement, interstate movement, intrastate movement. Look at these issues, because these are lots of I's to dot and T's to cross, and you have to know each and every one of them to be successful.
That's super helpful. Thank you. And I guess just, for a last kind of serious question for you, where do you see the psychedelic field or the psychedelic sector in 25 years?
I think we are going to see it more in the major pharmaceutical space. And when I say pharmaceutical, I kind of like to remember that a lot of these molecules, like, we're talking about, let's say psilocybin, it's coming from the mushroom, right? Okay, fine. You have that one molecule, which is pharmaceutical in its nature, but the same fungi can have other molecules, which may not necessarily you don't have to push them through. Maybe they can be dietary supplements. They can be food products. What I hope we will see in 25 years is, first of all, decriminalization and social acceptance. That's really important, I think. I think we are going to see a more mature understanding of the benefits and risks. And I hope what we'll see is the emergence of a new generation of treatment paradigms, which we cannot only guess at today, but I think combining psychedelics with new technology, for example, virtual reality, sound therapy, different kinds of therapy, we may well be seeing the emergence of new treatment modalities we do not fully appreciate today. So I'm looking at a scientific revolution, a therapeutic revolution, and hopefully a social revolution.
I love it. I'd love to see it. Okay, and now I'm going to end with a bonus human interest question that my brilliant colleague Paul came up with, and that we're planning to ask every interviewer, so our interviewee. And so I want to know, do you have a favorite fictionalized depiction of psychedelics, for example, in a movie or a TV show?
I won't say favorite, but I can tell you the most trauma bonded one. I was new to this country, and somebody told me, you have to see David Cronenberg. You'll love it. I'm like, okay, people don't warn me about these things. So I watched David Cronenberg's Naked Lunch, which is the movie version of William Burroughs' book. And there's a scene where the typewriter turns into this giant insect. I was like, whoa, that can't be real. So I went and got the book and read it. I'm like, whoa, that is real. But it really kind of captured me, because I mean, the fact that even after so many years, that vision is vivid in my head just shows how powerful a writer William Burroughs was. And I think, him, Hunter Thompson, they did an amazing job talking about what really happens in our minds, but talking about it in a way where we are not talking about, science and technology, but we are talking about it from a human point of view. So if you can tolerate Cronenberg, which I recognize is not for everybody. That's the movie that really got me into thinking about psychedelics.
All right, so we'll have a warning label on it, but that's something
Big warning label.
that's something that people should check out. I haven't seen it, so I'm excited. Yeah,
definitely set aside a week for it to recover. Oh my God, that movie was crazy.
Yeah, sleep with the lights on for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jay, I am so pleased that we were able to do this finally. I really appreciate you bearing with me on the rescheduled, and I'm glad that we're able to get this going.
No, my pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about psychedelics. If you have any questions about psychedelics, Cronenberg, William Burroughs, please feel free to drop me a line.
All right.
And depends on my mood. I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much. All right. And thank you so much to our attendees and for everyone watching on YouTube. And we will look forward to the next one.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.